It's a great pleasure to be here, and I think it's such an important conversation to have. So I'm delighted to share a bit of the experiences we've had in New Zealand with grappling with what does this well-being economics mean in practice and when we're making policy. So can I just check whether you're going to share my slides, please?
Yes, we are. I'm sharing now.
Brilliant, thank you. So yes, I've been working with wellbeing economics for quite a number of years, and the key thing that I would echo what Michael was talking about is, on one hand, there's been quite a long history where wellbeing economics in a lot of ways is not new. It's got roots back into welfare economics and thinking about what's the overall societal impacts and consequences of different policy options. On the other hand, it is also new, and some of the things that's changing is around what is in scope when we're thinking about how well we're doing as countries. And indeed, as Michael was talking about, it's going beyond the GDP or growth agenda. OECD really want to applaud the work that they've done to think about what does that look like and think about better lives, that it's got lots of different dimensions, including health. And the other strand that's really getting a lot more focus is the longer term implications, and this is especially some of the environmental impacts, but also thinking about well-being across different generations. There's one of the things that we think about is how do we actually measure the well-being as well. So we're going beyond thinking about just what is it, and that it's wider than GDP. To also think about how do we actually know, how do we know whether things are changing, and what kind of measures can we develop. And the last thing that I would highlight as a key component of the change that we're seeing when we starting to think about well-being is around distribution. So well-being is distributed differently across different population groups, for example. So there's a bit of old and a lot of new in the well-being agenda, and a number of countries are starting to have quite a few experiences with actually doing well-being in practice, and I'll share with you some of the elements that we've done in New Zealand and what our experiences have been. Sometimes people who are skeptical about using well-being in a policy setting might think of well-being as being somehow too fluffy, not something that you can actually do something about. And so that's where hopefully some of the experiences that we've had in New Zealand might be able to be applied or amended to be applied in other places as well. But I would draw out some elements of that and show you some examples. So one key thing, which has also been the case in New Zealand, is that the political commitment and drive is absolutely essential when we talk about a well-being focus. So this has been coming in the last few years in New Zealand, where the whole way of talking about things, well-being, has been really central. And that is coming from the political drive to want to focus on well-being. politicians are also playing an incredibly key role in terms of any legislative change, and we've seen that in New Zealand and in other countries as well. And sometimes legislation is used as a way of making sure that some of these changes to our systems are better embedded longer term. The one element which has probably been the most common element across different countries grappling with well-being and policies around the official statistics. So a lot of places are putting an effort into how do we actually measure well-being. And again, OECD with the Better Life Index is an example of people thinking differently about the statistics and how do we actually know what's going on in countries. Some places, New Zealand being one of them, has used the wellbeing agenda and approach as a way of looking at priorities in a new way. And in New Zealand, we've used it to inform the budget priorities, which starts driving it into really being a key part of the decision making for government. And the last thing which I'll touch on as well is that a lot of the measures have been at the what I would call more the macro level, which is measuring, say, for example, health outcomes at a national level or at a regional level, but they're very much thinking about the macro overall. What does it look like for, say, for example, New Zealand? There's another way that you can measure things as well, which is thinking about it in terms of specific initiatives. And in New Zealand, we've done quite a bit of work as well, not just to measure what the impacts are at a national level, but also thinking about for specific policy options and initiatives, what's the wellbeing impacts, and using tools like cost-benefit analysis to inform those decisions. So now I'll switch to just showing you some different examples of this from New Zealand. So next slide, please. In New Zealand, the Treasury has worked on what we call the Living Standards Framework for years and years and years. So it's been under development for more than 10 years. The government that came in a few years ago said, well, actually, we think when we think about well-being, we'll use that as a way into it. And the New Zealand Living Standards Framework has been, in the current form, is very much aligned with the OECD work and the Better Life Index. So if you're familiar with that, you'll see that a lot of the areas seems very consistent with the OECD work. One of the advantages of that is that it gives us more where we can have comparisons with other countries and learn how is New Zealand doing compared to, say, for example, an OECD average or whatever we want to look at. And so that can be really helpful. A number of people have been concerned, though, also that is it something that's really tailored to the New Zealand way of looking at things. And in general, yes. There was one other area that we added that the OECD didn't have, which is around the cultural identity. And we have also developed a framework which is more applicable using a lens from a more Indigenous perspective. So we don't see it as the only way of looking at well-being, but we see it as a really helpful way of looking at well-being. And for each of those different areas, for the different domains, there's a range of indicators. Some of them that Treasury has got like a dashboard of indicators looking at those. But more importantly, Statistics New Zealand has also got a whole range of well-being indicators that's sitting below, say, for example, in terms of housing or time use, having different statistics that people can look at for those. So the Living Standards Framework has provided a really good common base, a way of thinking about well-being. And the key point to take away from this is that this is much broader than just GDP. So we're thinking about well-being in a truly multi-dimensional sense. Excuse me. And we're thinking about it over time and thinking about the distributional side as well. Next slide, please. So how can we use frameworks like this? So you'll be familiar with the all of the different challenges that COVID has brought along for all of us. And one of the things that we did as we were looking at different policies in relation to COVID was thinking about it from all of these different dimensions of well-being. And, you know, in one sense, you could say, especially when we were making decisions very quickly, sorry, I'm getting a lot of echo. Thank you. So you know, when we were looking at really quick decisions, it was about basically, you know, is it saving lives? Is it saving jobs? Were the two key lenses that we'd be thinking about. But as you can see, when you look through a broader lens, there's lots of different things that we were taking into account when we were thinking about the different impacts. And so, for example, social connections has been absolutely key. And it's not just been about saving lives, but often the mental health issues has been really important when we're thinking about the different policy options and choices in relation to COVID. Next slide, please. This is an example of just to illustrate how we include well-being when we think about it in a budget context. So one of the things that the government has done in New Zealand is that we've changed the Public Finance Act, and it includes some additional requirements for government to be really transparent about the well-being objectives that the budget decisions are meant to achieve and contribute to. There's also a new requirement on the Treasury to provide a well-being report. The first one will be in 2022, and that is a way of making it part of a central part of what government is doing, that the Treasury has now got this responsibility. So this is broader than just the budget, but it will provide a backdrop for thinking about public finances. So that's why the Treasury has got that responsibility. Now, in the diagram, if you look at the top, you'll see an example of what I call sort of more of a macro perspective on indicators. So this is where we might be looking at, are there any areas that's looking like we're not performing very well as a country? And you can use it for saying what might be priority areas to work on. So like it fed into government thinking about its priorities, and it also fed into how we were thinking about budget priorities. And then the lower level is what I was talking about in terms of more the micro level. When you've got specific initiatives, it's really important to then also analyze that from that broader lens across time, and getting much more specific about what difference is a policy option going to make in terms of people's lives. Next slide, please. So this is an example of the kind of templates that we've been using in budgets in New Zealand for the last 3 years or so. This one is from 2019, which is one of the ones that's publicly available. But and the last few years is similar, though it's moved a little bit. But essentially what it's looking to do is capture what are the different impacts of a proposal, and making clear how does that relate to the different wellbeing domains. So I've been working a lot with agencies over the years, and it's getting them to think really broadly about the different impacts. So, for example,
Når nu har jeg fået lyd på. Oppe i oppe. Nå, det er fordi man bliver så bare forvirret.
Thank you. So, so in terms of the wellbeing analysis, we're thinking about the different domains and getting people to go really broadly. It's very typical that ministries, for example, would be thinking about the impacts that are directly relevant to their area. So in health, typically they would know a lot about the health impacts, but when we looked at it, sometimes it may actually be that, say, for example, employment impacts, which they don't necessarily know a lot about, might be more significant than the direct health impacts. Or, for example, their ability to have social connections might be a lot more important than the direct health impact, whether it be the physical or the mental health impacts. So getting that broad approach to how's this really affecting people's lives has been really an important part, and having the framework provides a way of making sure people think about well-being in a broad sense. Elizabeth, just get you to turn off your mic, please. Thank you. So in some ways this is not complex, but it does mean that people are thinking about policy in a different way from the way that they've typically done previously. We have been doing quite a bit of work on using like cost-benefit analysis as well, eller konsekvensberegninger, you would call it in Danish probably. And a lot of that has been around getting people into a space where they both were thinking about how do we actually value impacts that we don't normally value, and especially things like mental health. There's been quite a lot of progress in recent years for being able to put values to things that we haven't been able to put values to previously. And also the importance of thinking about when we're doing analysis like cost-benefit analysis, that it's not just about the impacts that we can monetize, but we look at all of the impacts, whether or not they can be monetized. So again, it's thinking about those impacts on people's lives from that broad long-term lens, and so it's stretching the way that we are analyzing different proposals. So I'll wrap it up here, but happy to talk further as we're going through the day. But the main thing is really encourage people to pick up well-being as a way of approaching decision making, and that you can do it in a really straightforward and practical way. It doesn't have to be only very high level. You can take it from high level to really specific initiatives as well. So we found it to be a really helpful way of progressing how we're thinking about policy and policy options in New Zealand.